Our next founder is Mary Katherine Goddard. Mary Katherine Goddard came from Rhode Island. Unfortunately, her father, who I believe was a physician, her father was a postmaster in Rhode Island, and he passed away at just 17 years old. And she actually took over for a bit her job as postmaster. Now, her brother was publishing a newspaper in Providence at the time. Her brother, William Goddard, would in his own right be an important publisher during the American Revolution. But eventually, Mary, her brother, and her mother all moved down to Philadelphia for a moment and then permanently to Baltimore, Maryland. And her brother, William, starts a paper, the Maryland Journal. But her brother, William, would just kept leaving. And essentially, Mary Katherine would take over running the Maryland Journal, and she would end up doing this for the rest of her life. And not only did her print house publish the Maryland Journal, but she published anything a print house would: several books, many pamphlets, even an almanac, making her one of the. There were a handful of the female publishers in colonial America, and she sides with the Americans when the American Revolution breaks out. As someone who was a printer, the Stamp Act in 1765 very much affected her business, and as with most publishers, she joined, as I said, the Patriots. Now, due to the training she had received from her father as a teenager, and her position that she had elevated herself to in Baltimore, she's actually appointed to the position of Baltimore Postmaster. So not a Postmaster General, just Baltimore, but still a very important position overseeing the delivery of letters. Not a position you would usually see a woman achieve at this point in time in history, but she does. She becomes Postmaster of Baltimore just as the Revolutionary War breaks out. In fact, it's the Revolutionary government that gives her this position. Now, at the end of 1776, the British take over Philadelphia. When the British take over Philadelphia, well, the Continental Congress goes running away. Now, this is not the real takeover of Philadelphia. That would be the following year, but they thought that Congress was going to be taking over. So Continental Congress goes to Baltimore very briefly for just a few months. But while they're there, they need someone to print something for them. They need someone to print the Declaration of Independence. You see, the Declaration of Independence had been printed by John Dunlap with the Dunlap broadsides in the days after the vote for independence had taken place, and then it was sent out all around to George Washington. It was sent to all the states. It was sent over to Europe, declaring, hey, we're an independent country now. You're going to have to deal with that. Also, they had a broadside created that was an engrossment created for them all to sign, and that took a little bit longer, and that's why they don't actually sign the Declaration of Independence till August 2nd of 1776. But when they go to Baltimore, there had only been a handful of copies printed, and none with the signers' names on it, because most of the copies that had been printed at that point was before anyone signed anything. So they go to the local printmaster in Baltimore to have more copies printed up for mass publication for the general public. And who's that local printer in Baltimore? Well, it's Miss Goddard over here. And Mary Katherine Goddard prints the Declaration of Independence. Not only does she print the Declaration of Independence, but she's the first person to print the Declaration of Independence and all the signers' names on the bottom. She is the one who revealed to the world those very people who signed their names to their death warrant. Now, I want to also note that this is the first time anyone in the world got a glimpse at the names that signed the Declaration of Independence. And on the bottom of that publication, what are called the Goddard broadsides, it says, printed by Mary Katherine Goddard. So it's not in the list of names, but right below all these men's names who signed the Declaration of Independence, the first time the world read these names, right below those names was the name Mary Katherine Goddard. Now, am I saying Mary Katherine signed the Declaration of Independence? No, her signature is not there. Am I saying anyone thought she did when she published this? No, everyone knew she was just the printer. But when we look for copies of the Declaration of Independence right now in the world, some of the most important copies are printed by and have the name Mary Katherine Goddard on the bottom. Now, I do want to wrap this up by saying she would print the Maryland Journal. She printed the newspaper through the end of the Revolution. Unfortunately, she gets in a little bit of an argument with her brother, who could be a little testy, as other founders would acknowledge. But she gets through the American Revolution. She has an argument with her brother, and she stops associating with the organization. Now, she does actually continue as Postmaster General for a total of 15 years. She is Postmaster General, not General, Postmaster of Baltimore. Unfortunately, when the Constitution is signed and George Washington organizes his cabinet and there is a new Postmaster General named Timothy Pickering, who decides to remove Mary Katherine Goddard from her position. Now, again, we've spoken very recently about Timothy Pickering, and some of the decisions he made were not necessarily everyone's favorite. But he thought he wanted to essentially. I don't believe he removed her because she was a woman. I think he removed her because the federal government was trying to make a name for itself as the federal government, and he wanted his own people in every position. And so, therefore, unfortunately, she leaves. Now, Mary Catherine, now she doesn't have her printing press. Her brother took it away from her because they got in an argument. It was technically his. And she's no longer postmaster. She ends up opening a bookstore. And she sells books and stationery for the rest of her days. And has a dry goods shop also. And I will note, when she was removed as postmaster of Baltimore, many local business people signed a petition that they sent to Timothy Pickering saying, no, Mary Catherine's doing a great job. There is no reason to remove her. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of her neighbors and friendly businessmen, she does not continue in that position. As I said, she opens up a shop and spends the rest of her life running a little bookshop and stationery store, and I do believe she runs another little printing press for a while, but it's not as successful as the original. So that is an extraordinarily brief overview of the life of Mary Katherine Goddard.